Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this table build. I have been working on this project in my mind for years, literally. Been working on it for about a year from start to finish, and this is where I start fitting the drawers, doing final touch-up and sanding, and then throwing some conversion varnish on all the components. I love sharing my process and showing loads of tips and tricks along the way. All right, I was pretty confident at this point that things were going to work. Although these little bearings in the back, I ended up changing those to a larger diameter. It gave me more adjustment and just seemed appropriate to be a little bit bigger diameter. My idea that a bearing at the top and one at the bottom would ride inside the torsion box, and this would give the drawer a lot of stability when it was all the way open. Pivoting drawers can be a little bit tricky, and I didn't want to rely just on the axle or on that upright shaft to carry the weight of the drawer box. So this seems to do the trick. Something like that. That is awesome, yeah? There was so much work to do on this table, and I couldn't always make prototypes of each application. So sometimes I just assumed something would work, and I moved forward. And here, this small bearing, I thought could have been larger, but even at this size, it protruded slightly below the table, so a larger one wouldn't have worked. And I did wonder if this would wear the bottom of the drawer, but this drawer's not going to have hardly any weight in it, for one, and B, it won't be open too often, so I'm not too worried about it. And in hindsight, maybe I should have rabbited that drawer bottom in, but now that the table is done, it's completely unnoticeable, and it's going to be fine. Here I made a quick jig just to nestle these aprons, and I could index left and right. Of course, I've got my domino machine held upright in a domino dock. I'm sure you can imagine that would be otherwise a tricky clamp situation. Super fantastic and very versatile. So obviously, aprons to legs on tables need to be really strong, and in this situation, there's a lot of redundancy with the leg being attached to the apron, and then there's a block behind the apron, and then of course the torsion box connected to the apron. So all that will add up to a very strong connection. So the slotted blue aluminum on the gray tabletop, that's actually where I put my woodpecker fence, but occasionally I can use it as a reference or a stop when I'm using my table saw. This may look simple, but I got to tell you, it was some really tricky joinery getting everything to fit correctly. All right, I remember being super excited at this point. Check it out, completely invisible. You can see where my pencil is, and the transition between the drawer and the apron just completely, virtually disappears. This is precisely why I chose to use vertical grain, and of course, wenge, the vertical grain of wenge and the coarseness of it was a good choice. All right, so I'm fitting these aprons, and this was really a complicated piece for me, probably the most complicated, one of the most complicated pieces I've ever made. Everything's curved. There's no straight lines, no square corners, nothing. But anyway, you can see this cavity, corresponding cavity here, and that will integrate there. I've got a square clamped, and another clamp to keep the leg in that pocket and square. And then these aprons, you see the angle cut there. This will get dominoes. It goes in there. And I'm trying to maintain this reveal here all the way around. Of course, make this tight here. It's very tricky. The slightest amount of difference in length of this piece changes this, and you almost can't see it unless you're using a low raking light. I want to get this as accurate as possible. When I get done, I might be able to adjust, one of these corners by sanding or hand planing that. Well, I won't be able to hand plane once it's installed, but I can still sand it. So I'm getting them as close as I can now to where this is tight and that doesn't show any shadows. This is the point where I really had to employ patience and take my time because I would not get a second chance to make things fit. And drawer fronts that I'm trying to make disappear will look horrible if they're off even slightly. Yeah, man, that is what I'm after. I talked about chamfering the corners of these legs in part 1, and this is what I was after. I like the way the line runs down the back of her stockings. Quote, David Lee Roth, Van Halen. Yeah, I'm a dork. But I do love this little maple detail. All right, great morning. Yesterday was a successful day. Got all the leg apron assemblies glued in place. And what I did is I started with one corner off of the torsion box, and I got this, these aprons and the leg all assembled, glued, right? And then I drilled a hole all the way through the torsion box and slipped this leg through, and that way I had it, access to do those two at the same time. Everything looks pretty good. I'm going to pull the clamps off here in a bit and check everything out. Of course, the real test is where the apron meets the drawer front here on the open side, and here on the other end. Yeah, this looks really good. That just literally disappears. I can do a little fine tuning. So what I'll do is take low raking light, shine it across here when this is closed. I can see a little bit of a shadow here at the top. I don't know if that shows up. But here at the top, I can just take a little bit off of this apron, reduce that shadow until that's just perfectly flush. So yeah, overall looks like a great success. And then now I can do a few more little things I have to do. I need to add a stop and a way to latch these drawers when they're all closed so they don't accidentally fall open if you're moving the table or whatever. And then I can put this top plate on top. Truly a successful key point in this build. All right, wanted to show you this real quick. Got these extra blocks glued on. So at this leg connection, of course, there's a cavity in the leg that corresponds with the cavity in this bottom plate of this torsion box. Those integrate nice and tight. I use epoxy in there. And then these two aprons, they go into this leg with tenons, dominoes, right? And then I added this other block here that is glued to the bottom plate of the torsion box. It's also glued to these aprons, and then of course glued to the leg. In addition, the top plate of the torsion box will go into here. It'll integrate into this cavity part. I'll add more glue and a screw going down into there, and that should be a really nice solid connection from leg to apron. Oh, and incidentally, I never worry about people saying that screws don't belong in high caliber furniture. To me, that's ridiculous. Screws, when used appropriately, can add rigidity and strength. That is awesome. So everything went in. That's pretty smooth. That one's not bad. This one gave me problems before. Yeah, it is again. A little bit kind of in a bind. The last bit of its travel, it looks like it's contacting here first. So I could either hit the end of that drawer with a hand plane, just take a couple of thou off or less. But super pleased with that. Here I have a machine screw going into a threaded insert. This will serve as a stop pin to limit the outward travel of the drawer boxes. All right, I gotta admit, at this point, I was getting super excited. Since I have a bit of Italian heritage in me, I like to think of large veneers as big pizzas, right? And I can just take these little clips and this double-sided sandpaper. That way I don't break that veneer. Clip it, and I can easily flip this by myself. And here's another one even larger. This one was 45 inches by 80, or let's see, I wrote it down here, 1140 by 2032 millimeters. And this one I just used a couple of sticks, right? Some regular clamps. I can just flip this over like a big flag. The goal here was to glue two halves that are veneered and taped on one side so I can glue the two halves together. So here I can just open them up right in the middle, raise that up to a peak, and then I can insert glue and continue. Using a table saw and my veneer sled is without a doubt the easiest, fastest, for me, best way to cut veneers. I'm using a Woodworker 2 by Forrest for the blade. You see sandpaper to keep them from shifting, and the seams come out perfect and glue ready right off the table saw. I like adding these tabs on my tape. It just makes it easier to remove, right? I'm not sure why, but nothing bugs me more than spending a bunch of time trying to remove tape that should come off, well, easier than it sometimes does, yeah. And here I'm just cutting some 30-degree angles or miters, and this veneer goes on the bottom of the tabletop. Nothing too tricky, but it needs to be pretty underneath as well. My glue of choice for all the veneer on this particular project was Express Veneer Adhesive by Veneer Supplies. It creates a rigid glue line. It's a dark glue, which worked perfect for this wenge. All right, so I'm getting back on the tabletop and I wanted to show you something. So this Marquetry motif, it was kind of tricky to create because, well, you're turning a scroll saw way in here. That would be impossible, right? So I made this as a smaller section. Here I found a few shots to clarify this, and I was really proud of this idea, and it literally took me years to come up with this. So the main tabletop is made of 24 segments, and so I took 4 times 6, right? So I took 4 of them, and I cut, does that show up? I cut this out, and I was able to do one little Marquetry motif, one species, do the Marquetry, and then do all of them like that, and then marry it back by I just seamed it back to the rest of the field. That's fine, and there's a seam right there, but it's a cross-grain seam. So even though it's tight, if that got sanded, there's a little bit of glue here and there, but if this got sanded, it would still look like the best it would look is a scratch, a cross-grain scratch. Can't have that, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a trammel and a router bit. I think I was going to try a 1/32 bit. It's a little bit small, so I'm going to try 3/64, and I can anchor that down and make a plow cut through here, cutting a tiny little groove and inlaying a piece of veneer like maple or something, just to separate that from this piece and hopefully eliminate that seam. It's going to be a huge challenge, not only with the size of the bit, but making sure that this arc is right on that line, because when I cut these, it was really tricky. I ended up book matching sections and then made one cut. The whole thing was stacked, and I made one cut through all of them at the bandsaw, and it came out really consistent, but time will tell if that bit will follow that cut exact, which is paramount for this to be a success. So wish me luck. Keep in mind that this is not finished, it's not sanded, there's glue, it's hideous looking at this point, but this little seam all along here, that's what I need to create a little groove with
this tiny dude right there.
So with a specialized push stick or push block and a zero clearance insert, right at the table saw, I can cut these beautiful and square at 44 thou.
All right, so I got some strips cut. So this groove, or the router bit, is 364, 47 thousandths, right? And I made these about 44, 45 thousandths, just a few thou under, and hopefully that'll give me enough slack, because when you add glue, things change quick. And let's see how this looks. Yeah, that's gonna slip right in. It's quite a bit proud, but no big shake. I know a dude with a belt sander. I simply cannot begin to tell you how relieved I am to have those cut. Of course, I need to clean up the corners and start doing the inlay, cutting the inlay. That'll be a little bit of a challenge just to cut those tiny little miters, but you just cut them close and then sneak up on a perfect fit with a hand plane shooting board or something. But I can finally breathe. Yeah, man, exciting.
The marquetry in the center of this table and on the chair backs was all created with the double bevel marquetry technique. I'll show more on that in another video.
All right, so here's my plan of attack. I've got all these pieces fit. They fit just about perfect. You don't want them too tight. Some weird things happen with stringing when you add glue. Incidentally, I'm going to be using Type Bond 3 just because it's brown. Anyway, when you add a water-based glue, PVA, to the groove and you start putting the stringing in, immediately and quickly, immediately, right? It starts to expand. And so if you make these too tight in the groove, you won't be able to get them in. The other thing that's weird is that since they're expanding with the glue, they're growing in length. Also tricky to get in. So they need to be tight, but not super tight. I am able to use this little chisel to stab it in the side to pull it out, and they're really not that tight, but that's a good way to get them out. Let me slip this one in here. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to be using a syringe to get some glue in there.
This is the reason I like them kind of tall, so I can stab them and get them out.
Let's see how easy that goes in. And if you look close, I mean, there's a few thou. The stringing is a few thousandths smaller. It's a little bit of a trial and error, but I've ran into problems before with stringing, so I don't want them too tight. But anyway, I plan on leaving this one in place. It fits good. The joint is right on this seam. Not that you probably won't even be able to see a seam once this gets done, because it's Wingate. It's very linear, and it's just going to make a good joint seam. And then I can just put one in. It'll be indexed against that one. I'll quickly get the other one in, pull this guy out, add glue, put it in, and hopefully everything goes as planned. I'm a little nervous. All right, so here's a good close-up of the wheel mechanism in action. This rod, of course, will go through the top plate of the apron, through that block of wood on the underside of the apron, and it will engage in this hole to lock these drawers from opening, right? And then this will be activated by the key. This will come up, and there will be a dial underneath the table where you can rotate this to unlock position, captured by another magnet here, and now the drawers are free to open. Locked. Unlocked.
All right, this is fantastic. And I thought I would take advantage of not having that top plate of the torsion box in place and put some lacquer on all of the interior components. Of course, I used masking tape, some 1/2-inch masking tape, and some blue tape on all the areas that will be getting glue later. Oftentimes, I like removing tape while lacquer is still fresh. It just seems to come off easier at that point. Underneath, using the shaper origin, I added my website, my logo, my signature, and the date of construction completion. And I decided to add the instructions for the unlock lock process.
Hey, good morning. I am super excited this morning. This is the first time that this part of the table has been on the ground with the apron and everything attached. So it's all assembled. I will just be working on the tabletop from here on out. And I wanted to show you this. I had these holes that I made in these two parts, the top and the bottom. And those were used as reference connections or reference points, I guess. So I could cut the shapes the same, ensure that the pivot blocks were the same. And I figured I might as well use that to connect this very positively by putting a bolt all the way through. Of course, I have a block in between those layers so I can squeeze the crap out of that. That is really solid and strong. And now, instead of just relying on all the screws and some glue to hold these parts together, I've got bolt connections. Because inevitably, somebody will end up picking this tabletop up by the tabletop instead of grabbing it from underneath. But anyway, should be nice and secure. And a little bit of a sneak peek. Boom! Yeah, man. Beautiful progress.
This is probably well known, but when your laminations are going to count, you must index your board so you can put those slices exactly back in the order they came off, yeah? Nothing too tricky here. I made a simple particle board form, anchored it to a piece of melamine, and glued up my first table edge. If you're building a piece of furniture like this and you want a inlay right around the inside of the perimeter, you can cheat by adding a piece of veneer on the inside of your lamination. It actually makes it a bit stronger and gives it a little pizzazz. I talked about this in one of my chop saw videos. These are superb. It's basically a zero clearance fence. These are a huge help, not only in lining up your cut, but it's going to back up the bottom and the rear side of the cut. All right, first end of my first piece of edging, and I believe that's going to work. Here I'm cutting some 1/4 inch plywood, probably a 6mm, and an easy way to cut curved splines is with this curved template that matches the curve of the table edge, and I don't worry too much about the radiuses being slightly different on the inside and the outside because they're just splines, so there's a little bit of slack on the inside of the rebate, or the groove, I should say. Here I'm just roughly getting rid of any bits of glue that could be in the way that could drag in the router base and create a scratch. You may have noticed instead of using one long spline, I just made it in sections. The piece of plywood I used was a little bit warped, and so it was a good place to use that warped plywood. And then, of course, I make a custom sized or shaped one on the corners. If you saw my first video, you may have seen these C-clamp type edge clamps, and they work okay. Actually, no, they don't. They're crap. I even added sandpaper blocks to them, which helped, but they still slip and they're really cumbersome. They're very slow in action. So I ended up getting these Bessies. These things are amazing. Initially, I ordered one of each size, a KF4 and a KF3, I believe. They are spectacular, and so I just ended up getting a bunch more. Pricey? Yeah. Worth it? Also, yeah.
So that worked really well by adding these pieces here at the end, dry clamped in place. That gave this place a point of termination. I could double check as I was placing this with this tape. So I just put a piece of tape across there, then cut it right on the seam. And then when I apply this edging, I can easily line up the edges of the tape. If that's good, I should be in place, right? And it looks good so far, so now I can continue putting on these other pieces. But that's going to be nice and solid. I'm protruding slightly so I can flush that up. I didn't worry about any of this glue because I can clean that up easily. And a lot of times with Wingate, since it's so coarse and porous, if you try to smear some of that glue, you're just going to smear it into that open grain or those pores, you know what I mean? So I just leave it. So not a big shake, that'll come right off.
Here's a simple clamping block to add length, and I added this slope to the cleat, and that prevents that top vulnerable edge of veneer from chipping, and it also holds this clamping block downwards. Of course, this was a dry run, which is really important when you have a complicated glue up. Funny thing, I am in love with these clamps. They're fantastic. You can slip them in place with one hand and they begin to tighten immediately. In addition, they're easy to manipulate the cam action so you can get the clamping pressure higher or lower. And long clamps at the corners seemed like a good idea to make sure everything was tight.
Hey, great morning. I cannot begin to tell you how thrilled I am to be at this point on this table build. I got the edging on, and in most situations, it's a pretty straightforward task, right? Square or rectangular or even, six-sided, and you have to fit all those angles at each corner. It's relatively a straightforward task. But when you have curves and angles, let me tell you what, the entire game changes. That is a challenge, and I am done. I've got everything clamped in place. I believe everything looks good. Everything looked amazing when I was dry fitting. So I'm excited to pull these clamps and go on to the next step of getting this edging flush with the tabletop. Yeah, man. All right, this is awesome. And I'm going to use a shop-made base for my router that looks like this, has this 1/4 inch offset. And with that, I can hover over this material and glue that's sticking up and route all that flush or close to it. Then we'll further flush everything up with a belt sander and then a DA sander, get everything nice and smooth, and put some conversion varnish on this thing so I can be done. This is super exciting. All right, so a couple things to keep in mind. I've got, it's like a slab flattening bit, I guess. Probably not the best, but it's sharp. I like large diameter cutters, even though this is only about maybe, 15 millimeters, 5/8. I'll set the bit up to be flush when this is held down. And so you can see how awesome this will work and the danger as well. If this tips just slightly, this entire tabletop could be ruined. So you have to really make sure, a couple of things, that this is really clean so that this surface doesn't scratch anything as you're moving this around, and that you put a lot of pressure back here and really maintain focus, right? And you can do climb cuts because I'm not cutting very much material off. This is practically flush. It's sticking up just not even a 30-second, maybe 20 thou, 25 thou. And if I'm on the outside, then I would want to do a climb cut, working my way in. If I'm on the inside, then I could go, conventional direction. So I'm going to turn off the camera so I can focus and make sure I maintain pressure on the back.
By adding this counterweight. Goofy, effective. Yeah, that worked well. Nice and flush on top.
This is all sanded smooth, not finished sanded, just sanded flush and smooth, I should say. The edge has been sanded. Anything that is rough on this edge, when you're routing a profile, will telegraph into that profile. So this needs to be smooth. Made a sample. Everything looks good. So yeah, let's route a thumbnail profile.
Now, I love climb cuts, reverse cuts, backwards cuts, whatever you want to call them. This will hopefully mitigate or eliminate any tear out, especially when you have wood like this that's under tension. So a response I often get is, well then, why not just do all climb cuts? Well, climb cuts can be dangerous, but this big heavy router, it's not going to go anywhere. And I'm not doing full depth, so I do multiple passes, climb cuts. The conventional cut is going to pull your router in toward the work, so you'll do that as a final pass to clean everything up. Here I'm using an 1/8" round over, about 3mm, just to make that top corner more friendly, yeah? I like to be really focused when I'm sanding marquetry. It's thin, there's a lot of things going on, so I just jump up on the table and get into my work.
So I thought it was a little interesting to note that up to this point, I have not used anything but a belt sander and a little bit of hand sanding around the perimeter, but I haven't used a DA, right? All with a belt sander up to this point. That's a 150 grit belt on there. This is 180 and 120. I started with 120 on the perimeter because it was pretty rough to get the bandsaw marks out. So I'm about 150, 180 grit now. And I've got a few little marks around the perimeter where I just saw some little areas that needed touched up. So actually I can probably just go to a DA, and I'm going to use this Dynabraid. This is air. And I'll also use the Festool ETS 6-inch. So I'll start with this with 180. It's a little bit more aggressive because it has a 5mm oscillating pattern. And then I'll switch to the 3mm with used 180 for the final sand, top and bottom. And that'll be it.
These Dynabraid air sanders are powerhouses in the automotive industry and industrial shops. You need a big air compressor to run them, but I love how ergonomic they are. They sand incredibly well. Now, this is such a hugely important step when I'm doing any woodworking project, and that's utilizing a low raking light. And of course, the best low raking light is the sunlight. I'll just take it outside. You can see any tiny little imperfection. You can literally see shadows from sawdust. I take my time with this step, and I'll just go over it until it is absolutely perfect. Then it's a final sand with the ETS 150 and the 3mm swirl for a flawless surface. The table and all 6 chairs got finished with conversion varnish. It's a superior finish over lacquer. This hard and durable finish is highly resistant to water and resists scratches extremely well. This is Paul McPherson. He is the owner of Shutter Freak, and he is doing an incredible job. However, I don't have pro shots just yet, so I'll create another video with details, close-ups, glamour shots, and more. Stay tuned for that. Thanks a ton for watching.